donc bienvenue à toutes et à tous. Aujourd'hui, on lance le cycle des conférences Connexion du collectif Judeo-Greek qui a été organisé par Alexandra Stankovic, que je remercie chaleureusement parce qu'elle a fait vraiment un super travail. On a décidé d'échanger un peu le format. Généralement, on faisait une conférence par année. Mais là, cette année, avec la COVID, et puis on s'est dit, on va faire quelque chose d'un peu plus léger, mais un peu plus long, étalé sur plusieurs mois. Donc, on a un cycle de 10 conférences, dont 2 avec des professeurs invités qui commencent et terminent le cycle. Donc, Miranda Crowdus qui commence aujourd'hui, et puis Jessica Roda qui terminera en juin. Et puis, on a 4 conférences en anglais et 4 conférences en français d'étudiants et étudiantes des différentes universités au Canada et en Israël. Donc, le but, c'est vraiment de créer des connexions entre les étudiants et étudiantes, et puis de créer des connexions entre le monde anglophone et le monde francophone des études juives, d'où les noms. Je tiens à remercier Alexandra encore une fois, mais aussi l'Association d'études juives canadiennes qui nous soutient, et aussi le Bird Center. Hernan, qui est là, nous soutient depuis le début du projet, donc vraiment merci. Et puis, bien sûr, merci à Miranda qui a accepté l'invitation. Donc, je ne vais pas prendre plus de temps que ça. Je vais laisser la parole à Alexandra pour nous introduire notre conférencière. Juste vous dire qu'on est aussi en train d'enregistrer. Donc, si vous avez des problèmes ou quoi que ce soit, vous me le laissez savoir. Les enregistrements, c'est parce qu'on est en train de concocter un site web, puis on aimerait garder trace de ces événements et puis de les mettre sur notre site web. Alexandra, c'est à toi.
Donc, merci à tous et à toutes d'être ici aujourd'hui. C'est vraiment un plaisir de finalement lancer ce projet. Merci aux participants, aux participantes, aux invités d'honneur, à Valentina et à Elisabeth pour leur participation et leur soutien au fil de l'élaboration de la série de conférences. La présentation de la professeure Crowdus débutera après une courte notice biographique qui ne se veut pas exhaustive, bien sûr, mais qui permet de brosser un premier portrait de son important travail académique. Suite à sa présentation, nous ouvrirons la discussion avec vous, cher public. Sachez qu'à tout moment, vous pouvez déposer vos questions dans le chat et il nous fera plaisir de les recueillir et de les relayer à notre présentatrice au moment opportun. Donc, qui est notre invitée d'honneur aujourd'hui? Miranda Crowdus est professeure adjointe au département des religions et des cultures de l'Université Concordia à Montréal, au Canada, où elle dirigera également l'Institut d'études juives canadiennes. Ses intérêts de recherche se situent à l'intersection de l'ethnomusicologie et des études juives. Elle a obtenu son doctorat à la City University de Londres en 2016, axé sur les rencontres interculturelles dans le cadre d'initiatives musicales populaires dans le sud de Tel Aviv, en Israël. Elle travaille actuellement sur des recherches sur le patrimoine culturel juif et la durabilité culturelle, avec un accent particulier sur le patrimoine culturel immatériel. As said in French, thank you all for being here today. It is truly a pleasure to finally launch this project. Thank you to the participants, the guests of honors, to Valentina and to Elizabeth for their participation and support in the development of the lecture series. Professor Crowdus' presentation will begin after a short biographical note, which is not intended to be exhaustive, of course, but will provide a first portrait of her important academic work. Following the presentation, we will open the discussion with you, dear audience. Please note that at any time you can post your questions in the chat. We will be happy to collect them and relay them to our presenter. So who is our guest speaker? Our guest of honor, it is Miranda Crowdus. She is an assistant professor at the Department of Religions and Cultures at Concordia University in Montreal, Canada, where she will also be directing the Institute for Canadian Jewish Study. Crowdus' research interests lie at the intersection of ethnomusicology and Jewish studies. She earned her doctorate at the City University of London in 2016. Her doctoral research focused on intercultural encounters and grassroots music-making initiatives in South Tel Aviv, Israel. She's currently working on research on Jewish cultural heritage and cultural sustainability with a particular emphasis on intangible cultural heritage. Professor Crowdus, the floor is now yours.
Yeah, thank you so much, Alexandra. Bonjour à tous. Tout d'abord, je tiens à remercier Alexandra et Valentina de m'avoir invitée à donner cette conférence. Merci beaucoup. J'étais très heureuse que vous m'avez contactée et j'ai pris l'opportunité d'en apprendre davantage sur votre groupe et j'ai hâte d'entendre les prochaines conférences. Je pense que c'est juste important d'ajouter que je suis née à Montréal, j'ai grandi à Montréal, à Outremont, dans la communauté juive orthodoxe moderne. Puis, je suis allée à l'école Face jusqu'au coin, à côté de métro McGill. Fait tout cela pour dire que prendre cet emploi à Concordia, c'est un retour aux sources pour moi. Je tiens également à ajouter que je vois un besoin de soutenir des initiatives bilingues comme celle-ci, car je pense que c'est important. Ils sont peut-être pas suffisamment représentés dans le domaine des études juives canadiennes. Juste pour dire ça. Cela dit, je m'excuse si mon français n'est pas excellent. J'enseigne en anglais et en allemand depuis longtemps, depuis des années, fait que c'est un peu rouillé. Et des mots allemands me viennent constamment en tête lorsque j'essaye de m'exprimer spontanément. Mais je fais le mieux possible, puis j'espère que ça va améliorer avec le temps. Alors, je commence. Faut que je partage mon écran. This talk explores my ongoing research on the musical liturgical practices of the Romaniote Jewish communities, past and present. Today, I'm going to mainly talk about the case study itself, but in terms of my broader research interest, of particular interest is the way in which this religious musical transmission and transformation, this kind of grassroots reanimation of a collective, can be analyzed to enable the development of cultural sustainability practices that are in fact potentially applicable to multiple contexts and conditions. Now, to those of you who've heard my talks on the Romaniotes before, there might be some review, if you like, but there'll be a lot of new information as well as the research kind of develops. Specifically, in this contemporary Romaniote Yom Kippur service in Ioannina that I'm going to describe, I argue that sustainability in the face of rupture is achieved through a specific process of a relationship between zecher, which means to remembrance, to remember, and churban, which means destruction. So this process of remembering past destruction, which is a process that is, on the one hand, similar to those embedded in many Jewish communities and many kind of ritual religious practices and commemorations, but on the other hand, is very distinctive to the Romaniotes. For those of you who don't know, this is a kind of a new term for you, Romaniote. Who are they? Over the past 2,000 years, the Romaniote Jews have survived in Greece and surrounding areas under different rulers and regimes. They are identified by distinctive, unique religious and cultural practices, including their language, Yevanic or Judeo-Greek, clothing, cuisine, and their particular musical repertoires. Historically, these repertoires included hymns in Judeo-Greek, a particular mode of Torah cantillation, as well as Judeo-Greek folk songs. Romaniote liturgical musical practices emerged from a Jewish tradition that has experienced many changes throughout the centuries in light of oral transmission. In turn, the transmission of Romaniote repertoires was cut off by the Holocaust. Arguably, the Romaniote musical repertoire that remains has undergone drastic transformation, reflecting its adaptation to new environments and also owing to gaps in memory resulting from the near destruction of the community during the Holocaust. Thus, this study to me is extremely important, it's extremely imperative, but also I think it's exemplary of cultural sustainability methods, which are my primary interest. So this is just a very, it doesn't correspond to exact, historic dates, but it gives you a kind of overview, if you like, of the Romaniote historic timeline. And this is devised by me, but also by the Romaniotes themselves, how they view their history. So it is quite interesting. And as you can see, we don't know when it originated, but it goes back very early to biblical times. Actual evidence only dates back to the 3rd century only, the 3rd century BCE. According to Ray Dalvin, who is a New York City historian and playwright who is Romaniote herself, and she's kind of the first contemporary chronicler of Romaniote history. According to her oral accounts, so legends maintain that a Roman slave ship was destroyed on the Albanian coast, resulting in the Jewish survivors settling in this area. Now, I think with the Jews of, I want to say Cochin, or is it the Malabar coast, there's a similar myth of this kind of slave ship being destroyed and settlers coming to the coast. So we don't know whether that's true or not. Certainly, there have been remains of Roman slave ships discovered off the coast of the Epirus region, so which is nearly here nor there. Rabbi Benjamin of Tudela, we're very thankful to this guy for, reporting on Jewish communities of which we'd otherwise have no knowledge. He does note that there were Jews in Corfu, and Ioannina, Arta, Patras, Chalkis, Salonika, Thebes, and Aphilon. So that's from his travels in the 12th century. The Jewish community of Ioannina is one of the oldest in Greece, and its presence is actually largely responsible for conserving the distinctive culture of the Romaniotes until the Second World War. Before the Holocaust, the Jewish community in Ioannina was the largest Romaniote community in Greece, and it was really the heart of the Romaniotes, both literally and symbolically. The long and distinctive history of the Romaniote Jews almost ended during the Nazi occupation of Greece, which began on April 4th, 1941, when the Allied forces on the Albanian side were defeated. On March 25th, 1944, nearly all of the Jewish population was deported to Auschwitz. Of approximately 2,000 men, women, and children, only approximately 163 adults survived. So we're talking about really, I think, one of the worst hit areas. Salonika also, other Greek cities with Romaniote Jews such as Chalkis, Patras, and Athens suffered similar losses, as did the Sephardic communities up north in Salonika, which was, of course, a hub for rabbinical leadership. As is the case of the Jews of Ioannina, many survivors chose not to return to Greece. Nevertheless, Romaniote practices have lived on in Greece in specific locales, largely transmitted through specific individuals and people who want to sort of carry on the tradition and dedicate their lives, to do this. And what interested me when I first got caught up in this research was in the past, I guess the past decade, an annual pilgrimage to Ioannina to celebrate a Yom Kippur service, or to observe a Yom Kippur service, a Romaniote Yom Kippur service, has become kind of this pivotal experience for both Romaniote Jews and others who are kind of connected, enabling them to remember and mourn the pre-Holocaust community. This process of ingathering of exiles at the epicenter of Romaniote religious and social significance generates, I argue, a new Jewish collective based on Romaniote identity and history that includes the restoration of the distinctive musical practices through transformation and reinterpretation. When I returned to Greece in the fall of 2017, I returned to Ioannina. Here's the kind of photos from Ioannina. Here you see the neighboring lake, and there you can see the synagogue. And on the photo to the right, you can see some sort of vestiges that you see all over the place of this kind of once thriving Jewish community that remain kind of embedded in the architecture, almost not discernible unless you're really looking for them, which is kind of a little bit eerie in a way. So I did return there to observe Yom Kippur. And I mean, the Jewish pilgrims, if you want to call them that, hail from all over, from New York, Connecticut, New Hampshire, and most are affiliated with the only Romaniote synagogue in North America, which is in New York. So a lot of them are kind of affiliated with that. But others come from far afield, like Texas, California, and Toronto. And many of them have actual Romaniote ancestry. But some are practicing and non-practicing Jews without any claim to Romaniote heritage. Yet they come together in this relatively remote town in Greece to observe the holiest day in the Jewish calendar, assembling in a new collective for the Yom Kippur service. The Yom Kippur service in Ioannina is led by Cantor Chaim Ishakis, who is a resident of Athens. And in my former work, we made a CD project with him. So that's just an example of it. I think it's still for purchase. It's a big thick CD set with some of the melodies. It doesn't have historic cantillations, but we had great fun putting it together. It is an ethnographic fieldwork recording series that we started, and so the recordings are in their raw form with very little kind of technological interference, if you want. The idea is that you can hear the pages being turned and the external noises and so on. And I modeled them after the ethnomusicologist Amnon Shiloach, who recorded many Jewish musical traditions, and also recorded the musical traditions of the Sinai Bedouin, where you can hear the water kind of rushing. So that was kind of our model there. Chaim Ishakis is very generous with his time when doing fieldwork. He learned most of the musical liturgical repertoire from his father, who was a survivor of Auschwitz. Chaim was born in 1959 in Athens. Both his parents were Romaniote. He graduated from the Greek-French high school, Lycée Léonin, in 1976. And then he left Greece for a while to pursue a technical degree at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. And he kind of was involved in business and so on in Greece after that. Was not really till his father died in the 90s that kind of triggered the desire to continue these traditions and to really take that on as his life's mission. So he's a very special, interesting person. There's more to say about him, but I'll go on to his the way he conducts the Yom Kippur service. How we can understand the way he interprets and transmits this, a contemporary person with kind of global connections. I argue this can be understood as a contemporary Romaniote variant of the older Romaniote service. In particular, the selichot, the penitential poems and prayers recited during the period leading up to the high holidays to prepare the congregation for teshuvah, penitence, are distinct. They receive special emphasis through melodic embellishment, but they also have declamatory passages to facilitate congregational singing. Destruction and an incitement to remember it are central tropes of the selichot, and in the way in which they are interpreted and performed by Ishakis here. I'll talk about two such examples. One is El Melech Yoshev, the king sits on his throne of mercy, which is a kind of central image in the Rosh Hashanah liturgy, and El Nora Alila, God of awe. For the congregation of Ioannina, the former is connected to remembering the destruction experienced during the Holocaust. The words describe God as a compassionate, merciful king who has the ability to mitigate the stern decrees of former years if successfully petitioned to do so. El Nora Alila emphasizes similar themes, but perhaps with more forward-looking positive feelings. At the heart of the Slichot are the 13 attributes of mercy that depict God sitting on a throne of mercy. This emphasizes a divinity who pardons people for their transgressions. The text is rooted in Exodus 34, verses 5 to 7. In most services, El Melech Yoshev directly precedes the 13 attributes and functions as a quasi-introduction to their recitation. In many Ashkenazi congregations, the attributes are given kind of special musical emphasis through florid cantorial solos, or communal singing. And there are several commonly used melodies in minor keys. I don't know if you've ever heard any of these. It goes something like Hashem, Hashem, Merachum Vechanun, Erech Apayim Rav Chesed V'Emet. I don't know if anyone's heard that. Sorry for my bad singing, which I do during talks, because I think it's more kind of potent than playing a recording sometimes. But that's a kind of common one that you see in some Ashkenazi contexts. Conversely, in a lot of Sephardic practices, the 13 attributes tend to be recited quickly with not much melodic variation. And the same applies to El Melech. In this service, Ishakis combines the two approaches, creating a new musical interpretation on his own. El Melech Yoshev is sung to a virtuosic E minor kind, highly embellished recitation, while the 13 attributes are declaimed in Sephardic fashion, almost like a shopping list, like very just abrupt. This is it, and moving on. When compared to this kind of sonorous, highly improvised part that precedes them, it's kind of striking. And Ishakis, I think, employs this contrast deliberately with two results. The first is that he differentiates the service from both the Sephardic and the Ashkenazi versions, while simultaneously referencing them as part of the connected corpus, if you want, or connected tradition. Secondly, he prompts introspection because of this abrupt contrast between the factual declamation of God's merciful attributes and the kind of musical introduction. For me, this contrast suggests that God's attributes remain unchanging and perhaps transcend musical embellishment. The singing of El Nora Alila, which is a piyut that begins the final service, the Ne'ilah service in most Romaniote and Sephardic services at the conclusion of Yom Kippur, does spark a change in the kind of melancholic, contemplative atmosphere of the previous Mincha service. It charges the space and participants with renewed energy and optimism. And I think that is important when you've been fasting and praying all day. You need that last push, to get through it. The poem itself is attributed to Moses ibn Ezra, a 12th century poet from Spain. Each stanza consists of 4 lines with 5 syllables to the line. This is just an example of verses 4 through 6. The 4th line of each verse repeats the words B'sha'at ha'ne'ilah, at the time of the closing of the gates. And of course, that's a very common image in the Yom Kippur service, that you can petition God only for so long, and then the gates will close. And of course, that cycle is started during Rosh Hashanah, when the gates are kind of opened and you have the 10 days of awe. And then really on Yom Kippur, that concludes the that period of time. And the text entreats God to inscribe the congregation the book of life for the closing of the gates, again, namely Yom Kippur at sundown. The poem evokes final thoughts of repentance as the service draws to a close, and the text expresses several points relating to these Romaniote pilgrims in Ioannina. The continued existence for which God is entreated is a collective, prosperous, delightful one, full of light, an existence that transcends generational boundaries and that anticipates rebirth and renewal. The gathering of the scattered flocks is a messianic reference to the ingathering of the exiles. But for many participants at this particular service, it is the righteous ancestors, namely the Holocaust victims, whose names actually appear on these large plaques, not in the entrance hall, as is the case in some synagogues, but right by the Torah arcs. And you can see some people's eyes during the service making their way to those people who perished, or even members of their family, which I found very, very striking, very moving. And this experience was actually recounted in some interviews. And interestingly, the return that's mentioned in the piyut does not necessarily involve a return to Israel or Zion, as is common, but rather a return to Ioannina. Cantor Ishakis renders the piyut using a unique melody, which is repetitive and energetic, as is often the customs in many traditions. The phrase El Nora Alila and the verses are sung to the same melody with varying improvised ornamentations. Here I've written the core melody, which spans B flat to E flat below middle C. The first two lines of the verse that you can see there are sung using a simple melody, but with lots and lots of ornamentation, excuse me. There are actually striking similarities between the tune used by Ishakis in this service and the Sephardic tunes used in other locations in Greece, as well as Iraqi and even Spanish and Portuguese variants practiced in the Netherlands. However, in contrast with other variants, in Ishakis' version, the tones are softer. The melody doesn't have quarter tones like some versions. And it's very similar to a local Sephardic tune, but he imbues it with distinctiveness. Essentially, what he does is he relies on a melody associated with Sephardic and Mizrahi practice and transforms it. And he does this often with lots of melodies, and I call it a kind of Romanioticization, if you want. And I don't know if anyone can read music or not, but the first El Nora Alila, he kind of sings in this very florid, ornamented style. And then Hamtilanu Mehila Besha'at Ne'ila is very, it's kind of geared toward congregational singing. So it's kind of like, oh, I have this wonderful solo, and now you're all going to join in with me. I can't really do it justice. It's like, El Nora Alila Hamtilanu Mehila Besha'at Ne'ila, you know, so it's very, ooh, and then kind of focuses. You've got this call response. You've got this great connection with the congregation, and again this push just to get through the last difficult part, if you like, of the service. Ishakis' diverse collage of melodies, textures, and declamations creates a contemporary Romaniote service that is newly composed, an improvised corpus, a blend of the old and the new. In some instances, different musical layers blend and are indiscernible from one another. In other instances, the differences are not only heard, but they're deliberately emphasized. This process shapes music that expresses in itself rupture and gaps in both musical and communal history and memory. Rather than abandoning or replacing previous musical traditions, the music has been restructured in a rich reworking, constituting what Frigesi calls liturgical folk music, which is differentiated from formal cantorial practice. While Ishakis' music liturgy may or may not resemble a Romaniote ritual service that was performed several hundred years ago, it constitutes meaningful heritage since it has been created in a manner typical to the shaping and transmission of historical Jewish oral musical forms. Many congregants described how the text and melodies of the piyutim trigger thoughts of their ancestral families who perished in the Holocaust. The recitations of the piyutim prompted them to recollect members of their families and others who perished, and as I mentioned, who are on the wall, often on the wall of the synagogue. Although this might be more evident to the observer, a melancholic irony emerges. While the participants urge God to inscribe them in the book of life, the Jews who perished are inscribed on a list of the dead on memorial plaques. Indeed, at the Ioannina synagogue, the Kahal Kadosh Yashan, the memorial plaques have been placed, as I said, really in this open space where you can really view them during the services. Thus, the Romaniote community that was destroyed during the Holocaust becomes a focal point during the Yom Kippur prayers. Those who remember former community members can recall their absence more potently. But hymns like El Nora Alila also move the participants from moments of melancholic recollection or spiritual supplication to a more forward-looking, optimistic mood with a relatively energetic melody and hopeful language of the poem. Many of the verses actually are positive and look forward to forgiveness and prosperity rather than just survival and collective continuance. Overall, the Yom Kippur experience in Ioannina emphasizes how pilgrimage functions to sustain Romaniote identity. As one of the participants from New York City remarked, "When I come to this place, I remember who I am." The annual pilgrimage is one of the events through which Romaniote identity is remembered and reaffirmed in the present. In this, music is significant in that it triggers and perpetuates a process of remembering. It's not necessarily the specific style or character of the repertoire that initiates this process, but rather the presence of the music within the context of the liturgy itself. As such, Ishakis' selection presents a continuation, a synthesis of musical traditions, if you like. While Khurban, as the destruction experienced during the Holocaust, is the core experience of the Romaniote Jews, Khurban also applies in another sense in temporal context. In his lexicon or treatise, Sefer HaSheikh Shlomo, The Delight of Solomon, the Hebrew linguist and poet Rabbi Shlomo Pappenheim explains that the biblical usage of the word Khurban, destruction, denotes that which is not inherently damaged, but can be considered destroyed owing to its disconnection from what it requires to live. Thus, a ghost town can be termed Khurban because it is abandoned by human inhabitants, despite the buildings being intact. The places themselves are not visibly damaged, yet their lack of a living, practicing Jewish population precludes them from being considered a thriving settlement. In this case of a synagogue, the absence of regular Jewish prayer and other religious activities is what generates this state of Khurban. The synagogue in Ioannina, the Kahal Kadosh Yashan, and even the town as a whole can thus be designated to a certain extent Khurban. Indeed, the absence of Jewish life in the city has been marked by its current mayor of the city, who's part of the Romaniote community, Moses Elisaf, who often comments on the difficulty of keeping the Jewish community alive. However, it's the process, I argue, of zecher, or remembrance, that reverses the emptiness that constitutes Khurban. Once a year, the town of Ioannina, now relatively devoid of a Jewish presence, is suddenly replete with Jewish visitors. Through the annual Yom Kippur pilgrimage, a ritual in its own right, the Khurban of both city and synagogue is negated as the city is restored and reanimated through the service. While the pilgrimage and the service are temporary, they are cyclical. Thus, Jewish presence in all its splendor is both short and long-lived. The impact, however, on both the few Jewish residents of Ioannina and the pilgrims is long-lasting. As such, the Romaniote experience can serve as a paradigm that Khurban is not necessarily a permanent state, but one that can be altered through human agency and occupation. This removal of Khurban in places marked by Jewish inhabitation is central to the Jewish experience at large and is repeatedly evoked in Jewish liturgy. Such interpretation is fitting for capturing the performance and experience of Romaniote liturgical music in Ioannina today. The destruction of community is remembered not only symbolically through commemoration, but through an active embodied affirmation of Jewish collectivity in a religious service that honors the continuity of Jewish life and of Romaniote distinctiveness in the present. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor, for this amazing presentation. If I may, I would like to open the discussion section of the event with a question that combines both the theoretical knowledge and the more practical work of your research that you have presented. The question goes as follows. How would you define your own positionality within this research or in your research more generally?
Yeah, thank you so much, Alexandra. That's a really good question, and it's so there are many levels that I could comment on, obviously in relation to this question, but I think positionality is something that is so important to explore, because not only because it's important from an ethical standpoint and so on, especially in recent years, but also because it can really, I think, give you insights into the research itself. So obviously, as a kind of meta-denominational maybe, but more modern Orthodox practicing woman, it's certainly very interesting to engage in the Yom Kippur service, because I'm already coming from a tradition of practicing this. So it definitely provides a really important traditional structural exposure, phenomenological exposure to these on a personal level, by which I can sort of compare, previous experiences. It can also be a little bit, it can inhibit fieldwork and research, because I won't go, for example, to the probably fascinating Rosh Hashanah service, because I want to spend it with my family. And actually, Yom Kippur is strangely the only religious holiday that with impunity, I don't know why that is exactly, but I feel I can go away, maybe that will change now that I have children who are of adult Jewish age who are observing it as well. Maybe I'll have to bring them with me to observe the holiday. I don't know. But so on a religious level, there's that. I will say also that just being a musician, that's also a musical person. That's a very interesting way to engage. And as someone also who does not, let's say in an Orthodox setting, does not lead prayers for the congregation, but will happily do it in order to educate students. So there's a kind of interesting role changing that goes on, that I kind of embrace, I think, organically rather than regard it as a contradiction, because I view the educational aspect of it and the transmission of culture as being so important. And I mean, that's kind of the elephant in the room, we said, when we talk about cultural sustainability. Especially with regard to intangible culture like music or crafts. How do you sustain it? Well, you sing, you practice it. That's the bottom line. You can document it all you like and write down the melodies, but at the end of the day, my view is that you need to practice it. You need to reverse the whole bun and fill the synagogue or your classroom with the sounds of the tradition. And that's, so I think I'll comment on those two levels, because to comment more would take up a novel, I think, different aspects of positionality. So.
Thank you so much for this answer. And we have another question in the chat. I'll write it to you. So it's from Hernan Tesla. So can Miranda explain what sets Romaniote Jews apart from other Jews from, for example, Europe, and makes them return to the site?
It's a very good question. And I mean, one of the kind of, I think you can get stuck in this kind of conversation where people want, as an ethnomusicologist, people want the authentic kind of Romaniote melodies, and of course it doesn't work that way. But in terms of identity, how are they distinct? I mean, the first really strong point is through self-identification. That's communal and self-identification. And what's interesting is this contemporary category Romaniote, of course, it's tied to all kinds of identities from the past, but it's a relatively new phenomenon, especially when you look at the Romaniotes, both in Greece and also in New York. So in New York City, where there's a kind of collective there. It was with this historian that I mentioned, Ray Dalvin, who chronicled the history of the Jews in Ioannina, and was kind of this proud Romaniote, that others started saying, wait, we come from this unique background, and really reviving their identity, whatever that might mean, whether they go to Ioannina or they go on cultural heritage tours, or they start attending the synagogue service or looking up information about their family. So that's what I find particularly fascinating, is this kind of return to the roots, if you like. In terms of technical musical distinctiveness, there's that as well. There's the Torah cantillation, which I haven't heard that anywhere else in any other musical repertoire. So there are points for distinctiveness. There are para-liturgical hymns as well that they chant. that I would argue are unique, let's say, that sets them apart from, let's say, communities that originated in Iraq. But that's a very interesting question. Again, I hope I've done it justice in this short amount of time.
We have another question from Ara Robinson. The Romaniote pilgrimage is parallel in certain ways with the high holiday pilgrimage to human Ukraine. How would you compare them?
Thank you, Ira. So I haven't done any studies on the pilgrimage to Ukraine, so it's hard for me to compare. What I will say is that what I know, from what I do know, this one seems to be a lot more diverse in terms of the people attending. So you do have these kind of Romaniote, people with Romaniote descendants and so on, but you also have, as I say, people from Toronto. You have secular Israelis who want to kind of get re-enthused with this Romaniote Judaism. And I see many more parallels with kind of these cultural heritage, cultural sustainability initiatives than the other type, which from what I understand is largely religious, mostly men, I think, will go. I don't see women necessarily going on that. I could be wrong, so correct me if I'm wrong, but that's what I see kind of going on. So I see a sort of much more diverse congregant base, and as well as having ties with the local government and so on, which I didn't get into in this talk, but which are very important. There's probably more to kind of be said on that, but I do see some distinctions there.
I don't want to put Valentina on the spot, but I think she had a question.
Yeah. Maybe just to go back to the first question that Alexandra, well, first of all, thank you. It was very, very interesting. To go back to the issue of positionality, but to stretch it a little bit to your position or the position you will have as a future director of the Institute for Canadian Jewish Studies at Concordia. So how do you think that you as a ethnomusicologist, what is your vision for the future of the Institute according to the role that it has in the Canadian context, from one side as a research center, so to develop research regarding all the aspects of Judaism and Jewishness, and from the other side, the connection that the institution has with the community, so with the keeping alive the community. So, and how you envision that?
Yeah, thank you. So that's a really good question, and of course has to do with positionality as well. I mean, so first of all, I should say identify as many ways, but definitely as a Montrealer, you know, as from the Jewish community, but also involved in many other communities, the French Canadian community, the music community. So, you know, to just say I'm part of the Montreal Jewish community is kind of not sufficient. So I think that what I would hope to bring is kind of a connectivity to these different spheres of identity and belonging, and also to come out of my comfort zone a little bit. So connectivity is kind of a really primary goal, and just to make use of all the wonderful resources that this city has to offer, and kind of just really, I don't know if capitalize is the right word, but just to really use the abilities that I can take on as being able to communicate in these different spheres, so that something how that would concretely manifest itself has yet to remain. A lot of that is dependent on practical things like the success of funding proposals. So a lot is, unfortunately, this is the reality, you know, that we live in. We have these grand ideas, but at the end of the day, we have to kind of go with practical possibilities. So that's one thing. I definitely think that as an ethnomusicologist, I would like to bring the traditions alive, so to speak, but without I hate this expression without throwing the baby out with the bathwater. So I don't like that expression, but I don't know any other better one. I'm very much a supporter of historic methods, so standard academic rigorousness and so on, but I'm very much for combining these with practice as research, performance, and engaged learning. So for me, it's kind of a marriage, I guess, between those two, and really just you know, reanimating, if you want, the student experience here at Concordia and beyond. I have some practical ideas to develop the institute, and I don't know if those will sort of take off or not. So these are just very much in the making. But I think it would be important to, if possible, to have either a board of directors or some kind of group from different Jewish communities, from different areas, yourselves, for example, just to give input onto the programming of the Institute and what's needed at the moment. So I would like something more democratic, something, if you like, or because I think there's all these resources available and they need to be used, and people should have a say in what happens, because I'm very much invested in the future of the Jewish community, not just as a monolith, but in all its diversity. As I said, French language initiatives, I believe in very, very strongly in supporting those, and so on. Practically speaking, I hope to also institute maybe a colloquium series. I haven't decided how often that should happen, but just to have speakers from all different branches, and to, again, embrace more conventional academic approaches, but also performance-based, artistic, exhibit-based kind of approaches as well. So I hope that gives you an idea. I mean, again, there's more to say on all these topics, but that's where I hope to go as of now. And just stay posted on the site, and you'll see things coming your way soon, hopefully.
Thank you.
Okay, we have other questions for Professor Crowdus. And we're not allowed, so if you want to speak and tell your question de vive voix, so by yourself, you can open your microphone without any problem. S'il n'y a pas d'autres questions, puis on peut constater quand même l'heure, il est quand même midi 51. Donc, si on considère, je crois que ça peut être de très bons mots pour être les mots de la fin de notre première conférence. Avant de tout conclure et de vous laisser partir, on vous invite grandement à nous suivre sur Facebook, Twitter et Instagram pour suivre les prochaines activités de notre collectif. Le calendrier des conférences de 2021-2022 sera mis en ligne d'ici la semaine prochaine. Par contre, vous pouvez déjà mettre à votre horaire le 15 décembre à midi la conférence de Jordan Chad qui s'intitule On the Origin of Yiddish Christmas Folklore. So maintenant, en anglais, noting the time, I believe these are the really good words that will conclude our first conference. We invite you to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram to keep up with the upcoming activities of our collective. The 2021-2022 conferences schedule will be posted online by next week. You can already mark your calendars for Jordan Chad's lecture on the origin of Yiddish Christmas folklore on December 15th at noon. Thanks again, Professor Crowdus. Thanks again.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much. See you in a month.
Soon.
Bye.
Bye.